great emancipator. Yes, the great emancipator. But we know names. We know some names. We know the names of Nat Turner and some of the leaders of Denmark-Basie, for example. And Frederick Douglass. Probably Frederick Douglass is the second most well-known figure in connection with the abolition of slavery. Right? And then after a while we get to the women. You know, they kind of get tacked on, right? So then you'll mention Harriet Tubman, you know, for example, and, you know, maybe Sojourner Truth. But the point that I'm making is that that in the way in which the history of the abolition of slavery is shaped, we rarely make the connection with Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And we are not able to recognize the extent to which that revolution created a new terrain, created a terrain which made it possible to envision the abolition of slavery. And as a matter of fact, there are those who argue that for a brief period in Haiti, Haiti was the most democratic place in the world. As a matter of fact, Haiti took the French proclamations of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and actually transformed those principles of democracy into something that was far deeper and far broader and far more capacious and far more embracing than the French ever did. I mean, this isn't to say that there weren't a lot of problems in Haiti, because we know that you know, there was a lot of violence. But I want us to think about this at this moment. I want us to think about the continuum on which we can locate the movement to abolish slavery. In the 19th century, you know, first, if we look at the efforts that took place in the latter part of the 1700s, and then the 19th century, and then we look at what I see as the movement to eradicate the remnants of slavery in the 20th century, the civil rights movement. I mean, at least that's what we usually call it, isn't it? Isn't it? And you know, I've been thinking about this because people didn't call it the civil rights movement when they were involved in the struggle. It wasn't called the civil rights movement. Yes, a part of that struggle was a struggle for legal rights. But the participants in that movement called it the freedom movement. As a matter of fact, the movement was short for the freedom movement. And, you know, freedom is vaster than civil rights. The rights of citizenship are, as important as they may be, do not bring us the complete picture of freedom. Now, during that period, major transformations, particularly in the area of the law, were enabled by the fact that thousands and hundreds of thousands of ordinary human beings, black people, their allies, embraced the struggle for equality as a way of life. And there were important individuals who emerged. I mean, we know the names of, well, Fannie Lou Hamer, right? Is that a name that you recognize? Or, well, of course, Rosa Parks. Everybody recognizes Rosa Parks' name. And then, of course, there's Viola Desmond here in Canada, right? But the major figure we recognize is Dr. Martin Luther King. And many people assume that somehow or another there was this man who had these incredible oratorical skills who simply appeared on the scene in Montgomery, Alabama one day, and people flocked to him, and they organized a successful bus boycott, and thus the civil rights movement began. But it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen that way. As a matter of fact, that movement was organized by women. It was organized by women. It was organized by women, and women were the primary participants in the Montgomery bus boycott. Why? Well, first of all, the majority of people who rode the bus in Montgomery were black. And the majority of black people who rode the bus, that is to say, who didn't have cars, were women. And the majority of women who rode the bus were poor women, were women who worked as servants, as domestic workers, as house cleaners, as cooks, as laundresses, right? And these were the women who decided that they were going to refashion their lives in order to build this movement for a new day, who imagined the possibility of equality, and who refused to get on the bus, who walked oftentimes, who walked from their poor black neighborhoods to the affluent white neighborhoods where they worked. And it's hard for us to grasp that, isn't it? It's hard for us to grasp the fact that we are here, gathered as we are, celebrating Black History Month, as a result of what a bunch of women who were maids and domestic workers did. And I think we need to reflect on the fact that it is often very difficult for us to imagine historical agents who do not have names. And we need individuals. We need to point to the first black man to be elected to office in the White House, right? As opposed to thinking about the movement that enabled that election. And when we think about, all of the changes that happened as a result of the freedom movement of the mid-20th century, it was ordinary people who were responsible for those changes. As a matter of fact, Dr. King, I like to point this out this time of year.